Watchman on the Pod. All right, we're going to pick back up in our book reading. Pawns in the Game by William Guy Carr. We are in chapter 8. The Russian Revolution, 1917. In January 1910, 19 leaders of the World Revolutionary Movement met in London. This meeting is recorded as the January plenum of the Central Committee. Ways and means were discussed to bring about greater unity. Lenin was again pressed to give up his policy of financial independence. Excuse me. He responded by burning the 500 ruble notes left over from the Tiflis bank robbery. Lenin was convinced it was just about impossible to cash the notes without getting caught by the police. The plenum decided to accept the newspaper Satisol Demokratia as the General Party publication. The Bolsheviks appointed Lenin and Zinoviev and the Mensheviks, Martov and Dan, as editors. Kamenev was appointed to assist Trotsky edit Vienna Pravda. The plenum also discussed the pattern the world revolutionary effort should take. The delegates considered the possible repercussions certain contemplated political assassinations would bring about. The policy of the party was set. The Central Committee was ordered to prepare the temples and lodges of the Grand Orient for action. The members were to be made active, proselytizing the revolutionary and atheistic ideology. The party line was to unite all revolutionary bodies for the purpose of bringing all the big capitalistic countries into war with each other so that the terrific losses suffered. Hold on, I gotta sneeze. Oh, excuse me. I think that's it. Okay. The party line was to unite all revolutionary bodies. Or did I skip? No, I didn't. For the purpose of bringing all the big capitalistic countries into war with each other so that the terrific losses suffered, the high taxation imposed, and the hardships endured by the masses of the population would make the majority of the working classes react favorably to the suggestion of a revolution to end wars. When all countries had been Sovietized, then the secret powers would form a totalitarian dictatorship, and their identity need remain secret no longer. It is possible that only Lenin knew the secret aims and ambitions of the Illuminati, who molded revolutionary action to suit their purposes. The revolutionary leaders were to organize their undergrounds in all countries so as to be ready to take over their nation's political system and economy. The international bankers were to extend the ramifications of their agencies right around the world. It has been shown that Lenin became active in revolutionary circles in 1894. It has also been stated that he decided to throw in his lot with the international bankers because he doubted the ability of the men who led the Jewish-dominated national revolutionary parties to consolidate their victories when gained. In view of these statements, it is necessary to review revolutionary events from 1895 to 1917. The Empress of Austria was assassinated in 1898. King Humbert in 1900, President McKinley in 1901, the Grand Duke Sergius of Russia in 1905, and the King and Crown Prince of Portugal in 1908. To prove that the Illuminati, acting through the Grand Orient Masons, were responsible for these political assassinations, the following evidence is submitted. The leaders of the World Revolutionary Movement, meeting in Geneva, Switzerland, thought it was necessary to remove King Carlos of Portugal so they could establish a republic in Portugal. So in 1907, they ordered his assassination. In 1907, Miguel Reis Lima, the head of Portuguese Grand Orient Masonry, went to Paris to lecture to the Masonic lodges. His subject was Portugal, the overthrow of the monarchy, and the need of a republican form of government. A few weeks later, King Carlos and his son, the Crown Prince, were assassinated. Continental Masons boasted of this success. Fernmont, Grand Orator of the Grand Orient of Belgium, said on February 12, 1911, quote, "Do you recall the deep feeling of pride which we all felt at the brief announcement of the Portuguese Revolution? In a few hours the throne had been brought down, the people triumphed, the republic was proclaimed. For the uninitiated it was a flash of lightning in a clear sky. But we, my brothers, we understood. We knew the marvelous organization of our Portuguese brothers, their ceaseless zeal, their uninterrupted work. We possessed the secret of that glorious event," unquote. The leaders of the World Revolutionary Movement and the top-level officials of Continental Freemasonry met in Switzerland in 1912. It was during this meeting that they reached the decision to assassinate the Archduke Francis Ferdinand in order to bring about World War I. The actual date on which the murder was to be committed was left in abeyance because the cold-blooded plotters did not consider the time was quite ripe for his murder to provide the maximum political repercussions. On September 15, 1912, the Revue Internationale des Sociétés Secrètes, edited by M. Jouvin, published the following words on pages 787 and 788, quote, "Perhaps light will be shed one day on these words spoken by a high Swiss Freemason. While discussing the subject of the heir to the throne of Austria, he said, 'The Archduke is a remarkable man. It is a pity that he is condemned. He will die on the steps of the throne,'" unquote. Light was shed on those words at the trial of the assassins who murdered the heir to the Austrian throne and his wife on June 28, 1914. This act of violence committed in Sarajevo was the spark that touched off the blaze that was developed into World War I. Farrow's shorthand notes of the military trial is a most enlightening document. They provide further evidence that the international bankers used the Grand Orient Lodges to bring about World War I, as they used them in 1787 to 1789 to bring about the French Revolution. On October 12, 1914, the president of the military court questioned Karbanovic, who threw the first bomb at the Archduke's car. The president, quote, "Tell me something more about the motives. Did you know, before deciding to attempt the assassination, that Tank Osik and Siganovic were Freemasons? Had the fact that you and they were Freemasons an influence on your resolve?" Unquote. Karbanovic, yes. The president, did you receive from them the mission to carry out the assassination? Karbanovic, I received from no one the mission to carry out the assassination. Freemasonry had to do it because it strengthened my intention. And Freemasonry, it is permitted to kill. Siganovic told me that Freemasons had condemned the Archduke Franz Ferdinand to death more than a year before. Add to this evidence the further evidence of Count Serzrine an intimate friend of the Archduke. He says in I'm Wilt Krieg, the Archduke knew quite well that the risk of an attempt on his life was imminent. A year before the war, he informed me that Freemasons had resolved on his death. Having succeeded in bringing about a world war, the leaders of the revolutionary movement proceeded to use the very fact to convince the industrial workers and the men in the armed forces that the war was a capitalistic war. They agitated. They criticized everything possible. They blamed the various governments for everything that went wrong. The international capitalists were directed by the Illuminati, who remained discreetly in the background, unsuspected and unharmed. Because Russia had only emerged from the disastrous war with Japan a few years previously, it was a comparatively simple matter for the trained agitators amongst the Mensheviks to create an atmosphere of doubt, suspicion, and unrest in the minds of the Russian workers, and finally amongst the troops in 1914 to 1916. By January 1917, the Russian imperial armies had suffered nearly 3 million casualties. The cream of Russia's manhood had died. Lenin and Martov were in Switzerland, the neutral ground upon which all international plots are hatched out. Trotsky was organizing the hundreds of ex-Russian revolutionaries who had found refuge in the United States. He was particularly active in New York East Side. The leaders of the Mensheviks were carrying on their subversive policies in Russia. Their first objective was to overthrow the power of the Tsar. Their opportunity came in January 1917. Cleverly carried out sabotage in the communication systems, the Department of Transport and the Ministry of Supply resulted in a serious food shortage in St. Petersburg. This happened at the time when the population was swollen so far above its normal size due to the influx into the city of industrial workers needed for the war effort. February 1917 was a bad month. Food rationing was introduced. On March 5th, general unrest was evident. Bread lines were growing. On March 6th, the streets became crowded with unemployed. Cossack troops were brought into the city. The Tsar was still at the front visiting the troops. On March 7th, the Jewish leaders of the Menshevik Party organized the women to put on street demonstrations as a protest over the bread shortage. On March 8th, the women staged the demonstration. The revolutionary leaders then took a hand. Selected groups staged diversionary demonstrations. Gangs appeared here and there, singing revolutionary songs and raising red flags. At the corner of Nevsky Prospekt, and the St. Catherine Canal, the mounted police and Cossacks dispersed the crowds without inflicting any casualties. The crowds who gathered around those who raised the red flags and cried out for revolution weren't even fired on. It looked as if definite orders had been given to avoid at all costs a repetition of what happened on Bloody Sunday, 1905. On March 9th, the Nevsky Prospekt from Catherine Canal to Nikolai Station was jammed with milling crowds, which became bolder under the urgings of agitators. Cossack cavalry cleared the street. Some were trampled, but the troops only used the flat of their sabers. At no time were firearms used. This tolerance infuriated the revolutionary leaders, and the agitators were directed to increase their efforts to bring the people into physical conflict with the police and troops. During the night, the revolutionary leaders set up machine guns in hidden positions throughout the city. On March 10th, an unfortunate incident provided the tiny spark necessary to kindle the revolutionary tinder, which had been piled up and soaked with inflammable orator. A big crowd had gathered about Nikolai's station. About 2 in the afternoon, a man heavily dressed in furs to protect himself from the cold drove into the square in his sleigh. He was impatient. He ordered his driver to go through the crowd. He misjudged the temper of the crowd. The man was dragged from the sleigh and beaten. He regained his feet and took refuge in the stalled streetcar. He was followed by a section of the mob, and one of them, carrying a small iron bar, beat his head to a pulp. This single act of violence aroused the bloodlust in the crowd, and they surged down Nevsky, smashing windows. Fights broke out. The disorder spread until it became general. The revolutionary leaders, by pre-arrangement, fired on the mob from their hidden positions. The mob attacked the police. They blamed the police for firing on them. They slaughtered every policeman to a man. The inmates of the prisons and jails were then released to stir up the bloodlust. Conditions necessary for the reign of terror were introduced. That's crazy. On March 11th, the depredations of the recently released criminals led to widespread rioting. The Duma still tried to stay the rising tide of revolt. They dispatched an urgent message to the Tsar, telling him the situation was serious. The telegram explained at considerable length the state of anarchy which then existed. Communist cells within the communication system sent another message. The Tsar, upon reading the telegram he did receive, commanded the dissolution of the Duma. Thus, he deprived himself of the support of the majority of the members who were loyal to him. On March 12th, the president of the dissolved Duma sent a last disparaging message to the Tsar. He concluded with the words, "The last hour has struck. The fate of the fatherland and the dynasty is being decided." It is claimed the Tsar never received this message. This control of communication systems by cells placed in key positions was used widely during the next few months. On March 12th, several regiments revolted and killed their own officers. Then, unexpectedly, the garrison of St. Peter and St. Paul fortress surrendered, and most of the troops joined the revolution. Tiana, I don't know what that means there, sweetie. I'm not monetized. I don't take money for reading. So I don't know what that's about. Okay, let me continue. Immediately after the surrender of the garrison, a committee of the Duma was formed consisting of 12 members. This provisional government survived until overthrown by Lenin's Bolsheviks in November 1917. The revolutionary leaders, who were for the most part Mensheviks, organized the Petersburg Soviet. They agreed to allow the provincial government to function because it had the resemblance of rightful authority. St. Petersburg was only one city in a vast empire. There was no way of knowing accurately just how the citizens in other cities would behave. Kerensky, the socialist, was a very strong man. He was referred to as the Napoleon of Russia. Through the good auspices of the international bankers, M.M. Warburg and Sons, Lenin was put in communication with the German military leaders. He explained to them that the policy of both Kerensky's provincial government and the Menshevik Revolutionary Soviet was to keep Russia in the war against Germany. Lenin undertook to curb the power of the Jewish revolutionary leaders in Russia. He promised to take the Russian armies out of the war against Germany, providing the German government would help him overthrow the Russian provincial government and obtain political and economic control of the country. This deal was agreed to, and Lenin, Martov, Radek, and a party of 30-odd Bolsheviks were secretly transported across Germany to Russia in a sealed railway compartment. They arrived in St. Petersburg April 3rd. The Warburgs of Germany and the international bankers in Geneva provided the necessary funds. The Russian provincial government signed its own death warrant in 1917 when, immediately after it was formed, it promulgated an order granting unconditional amnesty to all political prisoners. The amnesty included those in exile in Siberia and those who had sought refuge in countries abroad. This order enabled over 90,000 revolutionaries, most of them extremists, to re-enter Russia. Many of them were trained leaders. Lenin and Trotsky enlisted this vast influx of revolutionaries into their Bolshevik party. No sooner was Lenin back in Russia than he used propaganda to attack the provincial government, which had granted him and his followers pardon. At the beginning of April, the Petersburg Soviet, meaning Workers' Council, was dominated by the Mensheviks. The Esers, social revolutionaries, came second, and the Bolsheviks, for once, were the minority group. The policy of the provincial government was to continue the war effort because the majority of Russians considered the totalitarian ambitions of the German Black Nazi warlords a direct threat to Russian sovereignty. This policy was vigorously supported by Tekizit, I don't know how to say that word, who had assumed the presidency of the Petersburg Soviet in the absence of Martov. Vice President Skobelev of the Soviet, who was also a member of the provincial government, also supported the war effort because he thought that if the revolutionaries could help bring about the defeat of Germany's armed forces, they might be able to help the German and Polish revolutionary groups overthrow the German government in the hour of its defeat. Lenin's one object at that time was to obtain leadership. Lenin's one object at that time was to obtain leadership. He attacked the policy of the provincial government. He accused its members of being instruments of the Bolsheviks. He openly advocated its immediate overthrow by violent means. He didn't want to antagonize the Menshevik members of the Petersburg Soviet at this time. Lenin instructed his Bolshevik agitators to preach the destruction of the provincial government to factory workers and military garrisons, but to use the slogan, all power to the Soviets, meaning all power to the workers' councils. Amongst the thousands of revolutionaries who returned to Russia following the general amnesty was Trotsky. He took back with him from Canada and the United States several hundred revolutionaries who had previously escaped from Russia. The vast majority were Yiddish Jews from the East End of New York. These revolutionaries helped put Lenin into power. Once these revolutionaries had served their purpose, most of them were condemned to exile or death. It was only a comparatively short time before all original members of the First International were either dead, in prison, or in exile. The history of the Lenin and Stalin dictatorships should convince any unbiased person that the masses of the world's population, regardless of color or creed, have been used as pawns in the game of international chess played by the red international bankers and the black Aryan Nazi warlords as directed by the Illuminati. Further proof that the international bankers were responsible for Lenin's part in the Russian Revolution is to be found in a white paper published by authority of the King of England in April 1919, Russia number 1. But the international bankers, through the directors of the Bank of England, persuaded the British government to withdraw the original document and substitute another in which all reference to international Jews were removed. Francois Cody in Figaro, February 20th, 1932, states, "The subsidies granted to the nihilists in Russia and elsewhere at this period by Jacob Schiff were no longer acts of isolated generosity. A veritable Russian terrorist organization had been set up in the USA at his expense, charged to assassinate ministers, governors, heads of police, etc. The Illuminati, who used communism and Nazism to further their secret totalitarian ambitions, organized revolutionary actions in 3 steps or movements. 1. The changeover of the existing form of government, regardless of whether it to be a monarchy or republic, into a socialist state by constitutional means, if possible. 2. The changeover of the socialist state into a proletarian dictatorship by revolutionary action. 3. The change over from a proletarian dictatorship to a totalitarian dictatorship by purging all influential people who may be opposed. After 1918, all Russian Jews were either revolutionary Jews, clinging tenaciously to the Marxian theories and working for the establishment of an international of Soviet Socialist Republic, Trotskyites of they favored returning to Palestine, the Zionists. Miss B. Bakersville, in her book, The Polish Jew, published in 1906, has this to say about the ghettos on page 117 and 118. Social Zionism aims at converting the Zionists to socialism before they go to Palestine in order to facilitate the establishment of a socialist government. In the meantime, they do their best to overthrow those European governments which do not attain to their political standard. Their program, which is full of socialistic ideas, includes the organization of strikes, acts of terror, and the organizers being very young, acts of folly as well. The secret power behind the WRM also controls political Zionism. Yet the vast majority of the Jews who work for Zionism are absolutely ignorant that they also are being used as pawns in the game of international chess. And that ends that chapter. And I just want to make a note once again, and I know you guys probably get sick of hearing this, but not once did I hear anything about the Spanish flu. But I seen riots and gangs and all this stuff happening, but it didn't look like anyone was hiding behind masks and stuff like they tried to have told us. I don't know. I could be wrong, but I did not. All right. Next time we'll pick up in chapter 9, political intrigue. So until then, keep your eyes on Jesus, brothers and sisters. Your nose in the book, which is the Word of God. And let us embed the Word of God upon the tablets of our hearts, so you and I will not sin against God or be deceived. God bless you all. Tiana Rawlings. I do not know what that message is. I have no clue. I am not monetized. I do not take any kind of money whatsoever when I'm reading these books. These are not my books. I did not write them. Therefore, I do not accept any kind of monies for reading. God bless you. Bye-bye.